Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of House Chronicle, which is coming right up. But first, let me tell you about today's show. It's very special, it's very different, and it is very, very important. We're going to take a look, the second look that we've taken, at the terrible disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, which afflicts maybe as many as 1 million people, which has all sorts of social implications, and for which there is at this point in time no cure, and a lot of resentment among the patients about the way they are treated, the way they are isolated, and the way their disease is not taken seriously. Particularly, there's great unhappiness about the amount of research done in the US government for this disease. And of course, this is critical because this is a time when there is less and less money in the federal budget, maybe none at all, for diseases like chronic fatigue syndrome. I have assembled an extraordinary panel of interesting, provocative people who will keep you riveted, I assure you. We'll be right back.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. And now, the program host, nationally syndicated columnist Llewellyn King, and co-host Linda Gasparello.
This program is sponsored by Arizona Public Service, a leader in renewable energy, working to make Arizona the solar capital of the world. I promised you a special panel, and here is the special panel. On my left is the enormously talented Amy Dockser of the Wall Street Journal, who has been writing about this disease for quite some time and is regarded as a very important chronicler of developments in the disease. And on my left is Leonard Jason of DePaul University in Chicago, who is a clinical psychologist, but a critical player in this field. One, because you suffered from the disease at one time, one of the few people who has recovered, and also, as I understand it, you have been instrumental in laying out the parameters of the patient matrix, how many people actually have it, which the government has had some great difficulty in counting. An old friend and very talented colleague of mine from years back, Deborah Woroff, an author in New York, who's been afflicted for 22 years, but who gallantly fights on and comes down and helps us try to understand this disease on this program. And a new but most welcome guest at the table, Frances Stead Sellers, of the Washington Post, where she's the editor of the health and science section of that great newspaper. Welcome all. Let's begin with you, Leonard. Tell us succinctly, if you can, what is chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, this is an illness that basically affects probably about 1 million people in the United States, as you mentioned. And this is a very debilitating illness. And when we look at other types of chronic illnesses, the functional incapacity of individuals is at least as great as just about the worst illnesses that you can have. So basically, it's an illness that affects many people. It's an illness that's very functional, debilitating, and it's also an illness that people have that basically don't have good access to the healthcare system. Because when people talk about having an illness with a trivial name like this, and they go to the healthcare system, they're often basically shunted into more psychiatric care as opposed to the type of primary care that they need.
Deborah, would you like to tell us what happens when you get this disease, this horrible thing which you once said, and I quoted in an article and got 100 emails almost overnight about it, how you had lost much of your adult life to this affliction, if you will. Tell me what it's like, what happens.
Well, I think in terms of your functionality, the most important thing is that you find you absolutely can't move. I often compare it to being a car without any gas in it. You look perfectly all right when you see your friends. They say, oh, nothing wrong with you. You look great today. But it's not true. And then, in fact, what you also are is you might store up a little energy, like a car that's been given a pint or so of gasoline, and you putter along a bit, and you do a bit too much, and then there you are again, the car stranded on the street. But there are some key symptoms also, the most prominent of which I think is the excess collapse after activity or after exertion. And that really is the ultimate marker, sorting out this disease from things that are sometimes mistaken.
When you say collapse, let's be a little more graphic about it. You cannot move, you cannot get up and eat and do that sort of thing, or prepare a salad, anything?
Right. Actually, salad is how I judge my illness from month to month. I sort of remember back, oh yes, at that period of time I was able to make salads. You know, I had enough energy to stand up, you know, to do make up the sauce and cut up a few veggies. And then when I'm bad, I can't make a salad. It's just unbearable. It's as though you were doing the last 20 yards of Everest, Mount Everest, but you haven't done anything, or hardly anything.
This is a disease that I happen to know from my own experience of writing about. It has a very active patient population. They're confined at home, and those who are lucky enough to have the internet do not hesitate to use it. I have found that in writing about it, I do a column for the Hearst New York Times Syndicate, and I get more response. I wrote one this week, and already I've had more emails than I had in the previous month. It's extraordinary. Have you had that same experience, Amy?
Oh, yes, definitely. Patients want to engage. They have ideas and suggestions. They don't like something you wrote, or they do like something you wrote, and they're not shy about telling you. But I like that.
They have an attitude, though. They really believe, don't they, as a collectively believe that there hasn't been sufficient research and that society tends to ignore them. That comes through in all the letters that I get.
So I write frequently about patients who have rare disorders and often feel marginalized. So the difference I find is that with patients that have a rare disorder, there is anger that there's not sufficient money being spent on doing research, but they don't feel that they've been judged harshly or disbelieved. That's where the difference comes in with the patients who have chronic fatigue syndrome. There's an anger at being always having to prove to someone that they truly are ill.
And they put some of that down to the name, chronic fatigue syndrome, don't they?
It's a very challenging name. It doesn't really explain very much.
It sounds like...
I was just going to say, it's very interesting, the symbolic power of a name. Mm-hmm. And there are other illnesses, of course, where people will not want to be defined by the disease, but to say they suffer from a disease, and that's something that you're very careful with, not to say, to tell somebody that they are a diabetic, but they suffer from diabetes. And, of course, to define a disease by a symptom, chronic fatigue, takes away, in some sense, some of the sort of idea that it's coming from the outside. Or
Frances, as an editor of a whole section that deals with health, how do you deal with the pressure from patient groups, from lobbies, etc.? My disease, my disease.
Well, there are, of course, many diseases, many worthy causes, and we report news. I mean, that's the primary objective in covering what's happening, and so we report trials, and we will, as you know, have a lot of feedback, particularly in these days of the internet and with comments that follow articles. And so I think this has been a huge change in the way patients of all sorts have been empowered, and that they can respond directly, and I'm sure Amy can speak to this, to articles that she writes or that we put on our site. There'll be comments that come afterwards. Patients can talk to each other. They follow up on the internet together. And so the notion that in some way the media controls the message about any of these diseases has changed, I think, dramatically in the last 10 years.
This sounds a bit melodramatic, but in more than 50 years of writing in newspapers, I've had more reader response to CFS than anything else. Big political stories, big science stories, funny stories. This is the one that has really driven them. Of course, the internet is more sophisticated now than it was even 10 years ago, and certainly in most of my career there was no internet. But I have never seen anything like this. These people are held together, and there is this common theme. There is no cure, is there?
There is no cure, and I think kind of the patients, what we're talking about, are so angry because, of course, there's not a cure, but there's also not treatment available. So when a patient gets referred to primary care, often what happens is they sort of get thrown to the psychiatrist, who puts them possibly on antidepressants. And what they basically say is, we don't want that type treatment. What we want is to have our medical condition treated. Now, the word fatigue, which is in the label, is really something that might not even be the main symptom for many of the patients. Think about the worst case of the flu that you ever had. think about not recovering from that worst case of the flu, and then you have a sense of what you're experiencing. It's not just fatigue, it's actually feeling sick. It's like you almost have a poison going through your body. That's not just fatigue.
I'm interested that as a psychologist you would suggest people were being shunted or thrown to the
psychologist.
Because, you know, here's this extremely important organ in our body, the brain among many others, and can it not be part of the playing some role in this?
Well, think of it this way. Any chronic condition is basically probably going to sort of push you toward having more stress and having more difficulties dealing with work, family, and other types of associates. So yes, I mean, mental health is important for people that need that. But just think about it. If you had cancer, and if you had HIV or AIDS, and you basically went to your primary care doctor and they said, go to your psychiatrist and get some antidepressants, and that's how you treated you, that would basically get you feeling rageful. And I've spoken to many patients who basically have been out of the healthcare system. Once they tell people they have this trivial sounding name, chronic fatigue syndrome. By the way, it used to be called myalgic encephalomyelitis, and then they changed it. So once you have that...
Who changed it? Who controls this? Who has the domain name?
This was changed in 1988 by the Centers for Disease Control. And again, if you basically said, I have chronic cough disease, you'd probably say, well, gee, who cares? Everyone coughs. But if you said you had emphysema or bronchitis, you'd probably say, well, gee, that maybe is something serious. So what I'm saying is that it's not that mental health isn't important, but I've talked to people in Great Britain, and I think that you have some kind of connection with that country, where when they talk to me, they say when they go to primary care, they basically are not treated for all the other health issues they have because they're thought to be psychiatric, psychogenic. And that's the reason that they're rageful, because they feel that they want multidisciplinary, they want the best of medicine, of all the different aspects, a multidisciplinary team, and they're not getting that. What they're getting is 7 to 8 minutes of someone who basically doesn't get to know them and often prescribes inappropriate treatment.
Well, you know, Britain has been an interesting case, and those are probably the most unfortunate patients in the entire world because of a series of events and who knows who and who controls what. It has been labeled a psychiatric disease in Britain, and it is only allowed, according to the rules they give out for primary care physicians, you are only allowed to treat it as a psychiatric disease and refer, no matter how much nausea, no matter what headaches, no matter what weakness, no matter how sick they feel, you are only allowed to refer it for cognitive behavioral therapy or graduated exercise therapy. And this involves a long story about the last 15 years of British medical politics that I won't get into.
Probably not relevant here, but I'm curious about CBT and the exercise therapy. Is that something you don't agree with?
Well, there's just been a huge £5 million sterling study come out called the PACE, that the press release and the summary in the Lancet said, oh, this definitely helps you, and a lot of the journals in the United States picked it up as just based on the press release and said, oh, cognitive behavioral therapy is good for you. But if you read all several hundred pages of this study, you find out that, in fact, none of the patients who were very sick were treated. They were, anyone with any sign of a disease was excluded from the test, because obviously they couldn't get in for their cognitive therapy. And number two, you find out that on the only objective test, which was a walking test.
You're saying it doesn't work?
I'm saying that this showed that it made no statistically significant difference. In other words, it mostly doesn't work on most people, hardly.
Okay.
I'd like to pause for a moment for station identification, and particularly for our listeners on Sirius XM Radio. You are listening to House Chronicle from Washington, D.C., with myself, Llewellyn King, and today with Amy Docker Marcus of the Wall Street Journal, Leonard Jason of DePaul University, Deborah Woroff, an author from New York, and Francis Stead Sellers of the Washington Post. This program can also be seen around the world on the English language service of The Voice of America. Is this analogous to the early days of AIDS, where people didn't want to believe and where there was shame, and until some big celebrities, most notably Elizabeth Taylor, got involved and dealt with the shame issue, some progress was made?
So I didn't cover that, so I can't make direct parallels, but I do see this as being in the early days when a patient community is starting to get activated on its own behalf. I think that although it can be unfair, patients do often have to drive interest, research, and funding in their own disease. And when they start to come together as advocates and as to set an agenda as an advocacy community, I think there are a lot of examples. Breast cancer would be another one that was similar, where you can create the public agenda on behalf of your condition. And I think that's what we are seeing here.
I think breast cancer is a fascinating example because, you know, we think of the Susan G. Komen, whose whole movement was really prompted by her sister, Nancy Brinker, who was very well-connected and made it her career in some ways, moving ahead. What you see there is a raising of awareness. In terms of a cure for cancer, I don't think it's going to come out of the Susan G. Komen movement. I doubt it very much. It's much more likely to come from the hard-working scientists in their labs.
But it drives money, it drives interest and researchers.
Whether it drives money away from other cancers is, again, another issue that is a huge concern and very, very controversial.
But if you look at the different illness groups and if you look at the prestige of the different illness groups, on both prestige and funding, chronic fatigue syndrome is at the end of the list. In terms of prevalence numbers, in terms of funding, the disparity is just incredible. So all I'm suggesting is that, you know, if you look at how many people, and again, HIV is very important, but there's less than 1 million people with HIV, and hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent. With chronic fatigue syndrome, at NIH, we're talking about maybe $4 or $5 million a year.
It's very hard to get your hands around it.
How, as a journalist, do you keep yourself both involved with this and caring about it, and yet not being taken over by it and losing your objectivity? We all three of us, and Deborah, who is a journalist, except she's ill, know this thing that if you write favorably about someone, they think you've joined their team. And then when you write somewhat differently, then they think you're a traitor and you've let the team down. I've been through this with many subjects, from civil rights to nuclear power, that it's slightly frightening when people say you're doing a great job for us, because you know the next step is you're a traitor. You're a terrible person. You're worse than we could ever imagine. Having raised our hopes, now you go and say, well, calm down here, or don't do that. Or you just report somebody saying something with a contrary point of view. How do you deal with that?
I don't know. I feel like I report every story the same way, which is I ask both sides for comment. I read every paper myself. I never work off a press release. I will only read the paper myself and won't write about something unless I've read it. I try to contact the researchers who've done the paper. I don't feel that I'm favorable or not favorable on any story that I do. I think I'm fair and accurate. Those are my two goals.
How do you deal with this on this and other subjects?
Another subject, an interesting story. We ran a piece some years ago about what some people believe is chronic Lyme disease, and I know there are some people who feel there are overlaps between these diseases. And it was a piece reporting the state of the science, and also reported some people who felt the science hadn't moved quickly enough or didn't accept but reported both of those issues. And afterwards, I went into work and my email was overloaded, and the ombudsman got calls and from patient advocates. And so I began telephoning, and I telephoned some patient advocates, and I said to one particular person who was a leader of a group, did you think this, I was curious, did you think this piece wasn't fair-minded? We reported the science, and she said to me, well, actually, yes, I did think it was quite fair-minded in the end. And I said, well, can you tell me why I'm getting all these letters, including ones that were actually quite hostile and threatening to hurt me? And she said, oh, have they come on too hard to you? I'll call them off. And the next day, my email flooded. So it was a vendetta, in essence. On a particular issue.
But this is something we face as journalists anyway. I remember one night when I worked for the Washington Post many decades ago, when Senator Henry Jackson was running for president, and as the night went on in the composing room, we got more and more copy, and we were cutting down the size of the pictures. We called it whacking the cut, which is pretty illustrative of what happened. They put it in a big guillotine and went bang, and off went. And we lost a lot of his audience where he's giving a speech. Well, he thought that this was some deliberate attempt to suggest that he couldn't draw an audience. And I thought, my God, at 1:30 in the morning, we don't care. We're not on your side. We're not against you. But that's part of journalism. They may be a little more acute in this case because people are suffering and have this sense of no hope. Tell me about how the numbers are counted and how that works. And then we should talk about the belief that there's a virus responsible.
Sure. And just, again, just to comment quickly, one of the reasons patients are so upset with the media is that there are so many media stories that basically put patients down and basically suggest to them that they're just malingering, that they're basically a bunch of bored housewives, and that they're depressed and they should get on with their life. And that's the media bias that's been a problem for patients.
I'll never mistake you for a housewife.
So all I'm suggesting is when people who have had very high functioning and people have been very involved in their lives have had a sudden decrease in their performance so that they can no longer go into work, they're trying to figure out what happened. And they don't want to be patronized and they don't want to be put down by the media or the work associates and family friends who take those reports and then victimize them again. So these are patients who are victimized by an illness, and then the media further victimize them, and then also the medical community also does it.
Have you seen that sort of victimization? I'm thinking of pieces like Laura Hillenbrand's,
in the
pieces
New Yorker,
in the New Yorker
that was
and
an amazing
others.
piece.
Have you seen terms like malingering and?
I remember all the way back when, sorry, Newsweek called it the yuppie flu in the late 80s. Sorry, I didn't.
30 years ago, though. I mean, you're saying recently you feel the same way? I mean,
I would say the last year there's probably been better press, but I'm really talking about like a 25-year period. Let's go to the yuppie flu. The yuppie flu is still something that people associate with this illness. It's absolutely incorrect.
They associate the illness, I have found, with a sort of mononucleosis on steroids, the kissing disease, something college kids get.
So for example,
they don't take it that seriously.
When you look at the demographics of this illness, I mean, we did a community-based study in Chicago. We interviewed thousands of people. We brought them in for medical illnesses. And what we found was that basically most people who had this illness tend to be not yuppies, but tend to be in poverty, tended to be more within minority communities.
Those statistics on the CDC site that they're...
But I'm just saying that there was a period of at least 10 years in the 1990s when there was a myth that was out there that was incorrect. Now, fortunately, that myth has been changed, fortunately, but there's still many people who are continuing to be, I think, victimized.
The two subjects we have to touch on before we wrap this up, one of which is this widespread belief that there is a virus responsible, that it's a retrovirus called XMRV, which the patients really believe and want to believe, and there's evidence that it may be that, and there's dispute about it. Deborah, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it's, I certainly don't think it's a false belief. It's the scorecard in terms of testing done is roughly neck and neck between tests that have found that in chronic fatigue populations and tests that haven't. And that includes a lot of tests that didn't have chronic fatigue syndrome patients in the population. A lot of them did the studies on other people, like people with depression who were mistaken for it. So it looks like there's certainly an XMRV sitting around there. That's very common. Whether it's the cause, people don't know. Whether it's the only virus involved, people don't know. I think what it's doing is it's demanding to be studied more. And it's demanding that the other viruses involved, which includes some of the herpes family, also demand to be studied more.
Amy, there is a private clinic out in, or not clinic, institution out in Reno, Nevada, where there was one of the big outbreaks back in 1985 of this disease, and where a local developer called Harvey Whittemore and his wife Annette have contributed money to the establishment of a dedicated laboratory in conjunction with the university to study this, and particularly to study. How is that going?
I just know from what I've done in previous stories, so I don't know what's going on exactly at this moment, but they led the sort of team of researchers that published in 2009 a paper in Science that found XMRV in a higher number of chronic fatigue syndrome patients than in healthy controls that were used. You now have a number of groups that are disputing this finding there are still some major studies that haven't weighed in, and I think everybody is waiting to see. For instance, there is an NIH-sponsored study that's being led by a Columbia University professor,
National
Ian
Institutes
Lipkin.
of Health, yes.
Yep. So that one is still there. They haven't enrolled patients yet, so that's going to take some time to get the results. And there's the Blood Working Group, which is a federally driven group of people, including the Whittemore-Peterson Institute scientists.
I think we should
who are
say about the
researching.
Whittemores that the Whittemore's daughter, Andrea,
yes.
is very severely affected,
Yes.
and who got married but couldn't stand up at her own wedding in a very tragic. Now I'm told that her husband may have contracted it, which brings us to the question of how contagious is this disease. There are families that have it. I have a lot of emails of spouses who've gotten it or children who've gotten it. Very frightening to families, because if you lose both breadwinners, you're in terrible shape. How contagious is it, Leonard?
Well, certainly there have been some outbreaks and in different areas, Lyndonville being one of those, which the Wall Street Journal kind of had a nice piece on a couple weeks ago. But I think this issue, I just want to kind of, it's like, what does the media say kind of about some of these issues? If retroviruses come out as being a possibility, and certainly there's a tremendous amount of excitement in the patient community on this, what I see from the newspapers, not your particular report, is that it's all contamination. So when I talk to people, they basically say to me, oh, I hear it's just contamination. So rather than waiting to find out these important studies are done, the media jumps in and makes judgment, further victimizing people.
Well, the media covers the studies as they're published. You can't have the media ignore a published study. I mean, I don't know. I don't really agree with
we
the
can't
way
ignore it, and we
yeah.
have to, rather, at the time, we're running out of time here, so anybody got some quick...
Well, I have to say that the people who are saying that it's contamination are these British people who are absolutely brilliant at publicity. They stage things absolutely beautifully. If the media has been captured by them, it is no fault of the media's.
You have the last word, Deborah.
They are the best in the press.
This program has been made possible by Arizona Public Service, a leader in renewable energy, working to make Arizona the solar capital of the world. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week, and until then, cheers.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. From Washington, D.C., this has been White House Chronicle, a weekly analysis of the news with insight and a sense of humor, featuring Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and guests. This program may be seen on PBS stations and cable access channels. To view the program online, visit us at whitehousechronicle.com.